March 1943. Hermann Göring stood before a gathering of Luftwaffe officers in Berlin, his chest heavy with medals, his face flushed with the confidence of a man who had promised the impossible and still believed he could deliver. No enemy bomber would ever reach the Ruhr, he had declared years earlier. No enemy aircraft would fly over Reich territory. If they did, he had said, you could call him Meyer, a Jewish name, the ultimate humiliation for the Reichsmarschall. But on this spring morning, American B-17 flying fortresses were already turning toward the Ruhr Valley in broad daylight, their contrails scratching white lines across the sky above Germany's industrial heart. And Göring was still very much Göring, though the name was beginning to taste like ash in his mouth. The officers watched him, these men who had flown against England, against Russia, who had seen their squadrons bled white over 3 years of war. They knew what was coming. They had seen the formations growing larger, the American bombers flying higher, the fighter escorts reaching deeper. But Göring spoke as if reality were merely a temporary setback, a problem of will rather than mathematics. The Luftwaffe would stop them, he insisted. More fighters were coming, new weapons were in development, the Reich's air defenses would prove impenetrable. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had stopped listening to his own intelligence reports. 50 miles away, in his ministry office in Berlin, Albert Speer was reading a very different set of reports. The armaments minister was 37 years old, an architect by training, a technocrat by necessity, and increasingly a realist by survival instinct. The papers on his desk told a story Göring refused to read. Steel production in the Ruhr had dropped by 12% in the past month. The Krupp works in Essen had lost 6 days of production to air raid damage and repairs. The synthetic oil plants, those chemical miracles that kept the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft running, were becoming increasingly vulnerable. And this was before the Americans had truly committed to daylight bombing, before they had solved the problem of fighter escort range, before they had learned to coordinate their attacks with the RAF's night offensive. Speer picked up his pen and began drafting another memo to Hitler, knowing it would likely be ignored, knowing he had to try anyway. If the bombing continued to escalate, if the Allies achieved sustained air superiority over Germany itself, the war would be lost not on the Eastern Front or in North Africa, but in the skies over the Ruhr. The Reich could survive battlefield defeats. It could not survive the systematic destruction of its industrial capacity. But Hitler, in his headquarters at Rastenburg, was not interested in Speer's calculations. The Führer's rage at the Luftwaffe had become a constant feature of military conferences, a volcanic fury that erupted at any mention of Allied bombing. Where were the German fighters? Why had Göring's vaunted air force failed to stop these raids? The answer was complex, mathematical, logistical, but Hitler wanted simple solutions. He wanted retaliation. He wanted German bombers over London again, over Moscow, over New York if possible. He wanted revenge, not strategic analysis. The truth was written in numbers that German high command could read, but seemed unable to accept. By the spring of 1943, the United States was producing more aircraft in a single month than Germany produced in a quarter. American factories were turning out B-17s and B-24s by the hundreds, along with the fighters that would eventually escort them. The P-47 Thunderbolt, heavy and powerful, was already reaching deeper into Germany than any Allied fighter had before. And in development, though German intelligence had not yet grasped its significance, was the P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that would change everything. The Ruhr Valley stretched across western Germany like an industrial artery, its cities and factories pumping out the steel, coal, and weapons that sustained the Wehrmacht. Essen, Dortmund, Duisburg, Bochum, a constellation of smokestacks and blast furnaces that produced more than half of Germany's steel and coal. The British had been bombing it at night since 1940, but night bombing was imprecise, scattered, survivable. The factories could be repaired, production could continue. Daylight bombing was different. Daylight bombing meant precision, meant targeting specific factories, specific rail yards, specific power plants. It meant systematic destruction rather than random damage. On March 5, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force sent 230 bombers against targets in the Ruhr. It was not the first daylight raid, but it was the largest yet, a demonstration of American intent and capability. The formations flew at 25,000 feet above much of the flak, their Norden bomb sites aimed at the Krupp works, at the rail yards, at the coke plants that fed the steel mills. German fighters rose to meet them, Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, flown by pilots who knew their fuel was limited, their ammunition finite, their orders impossible. Stop the bombers. All of them. Every one. They couldn't. The mathematics were brutal. Each bomber had 1350 caliber machine guns, overlapping fields of fire, mutual protection in formation. To shoot down one B-17 often cost 2 or 3 German fighters, either destroyed or damaged enough to need extensive repairs. And for every bomber that fell, 2 more got through to their targets. The Americans could afford the losses. They had more bombers arriving in England every week, more crews training in the United States, more factories building more aircraft. Germany was fighting an industrial war with an industrial deficit that widened every month. In Berlin, Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's Inspector General, was drowning in production reports and loss statistics. Milch was 50 years old, a former Lufthansa director, one of the few men in German high command who understood both aviation and economics. He knew the numbers, and the numbers were catastrophic. The Luftwaffe was losing more single-engine fighters each month than German factories could produce. Pilot training had been cut from 250 hours to 160, then to 120, because there wasn't enough fuel for longer training, because the need for pilots at the front was desperate. These abbreviated training programs produced pilots who survived an average of 7 missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. 7 missions. Less than 2 weeks at the front, Milch drafted proposal after proposal. Concentrate on fighter production. Stop building bombers. Germany no longer had the fuel or the bases to use them effectively. Build more Me-262s, the new jet fighter that could outrun anything the Allies had. Rationalize production. Eliminate unnecessary variants. Focus on a few designs that could be mass-produced. But every proposal ran into the same obstacles. Hitler wanted bombers for retaliation. Göring wanted to maintain his prestige projects. The aircraft industry was fragmented among dozens of manufacturers, each protecting its own contracts and influence. And overarching everything was the delusions that the Luftwaffe could still achieve air superiority, that one more technical breakthrough, one more tactical innovation would turn the tide. The British, meanwhile, had been bombing Berlin at night since August 1940. The first raid had been almost accidental, a navigation error by a few aircraft that had prompted Hitler to order retaliation against London, which had escalated into the Blitz. But by 1943, the RAF's Bomber Command had evolved into a sophisticated instrument of destruction. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, commanding Bomber Command, believed that Germany could be bombed into submission, that sufficient destruction of German cities would break civilian morale and cripple industrial production. Berlin was his ultimate target, the capital, the seat of Nazi power, the city whose destruction would symbolize Germany's defeat. Harris had told Churchill he could wreck Berlin from end to end if given enough aircraft. The Battle of Berlin, as it would be called, began in November 1943 and continued through the winter into March 1944. Over those 4 months, the RAF flew more than 9,000 sorties against Berlin, dropping tens of thousands of tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs. The raids came at night, waves of Lancasters and Halifaxes, guided by Pathfinder aircraft that marked targets with colored flares, creating firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, watched Berlin burn from his ministry building, and his diary entries from that winter tell a story very different from his public pronouncements. In public, he spoke of German resilience, of the people's unbreakable will, of the terror bombing strengthening rather than weakening German resolve. In private, he wrote of his fear, his exhaustion, his growing certainty that the war was lost. After a particularly heavy raid in November 1943, he wrote that the damage was catastrophic, that entire districts had been obliterated, that the homeless numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He worried about civilian morale, about the increasing difficulty of maintaining the fiction that Germany was winning. Hitler's response to the Berlin raids was characteristic. He raged at Göring, demanding to know why the Luftwaffe couldn't stop the British bombers. He ordered the development of new weapons, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket, weapons that would rain destruction on London in retaliation. He spoke of miracle weapons that would reverse Germany's fortunes, of jet aircraft and rocket interceptors that would sweep the Allies from the sky. But he refused to visit bombed areas, refused to see the destruction firsthand, as if witnessing it would make it real in a way that reports could not. Göring, meanwhile, had largely withdrawn from active leadership of the Luftwaffe. He spent more time at his estate, Hall, collecting art looted from occupied territories, indulging in morphine and delusions. When he did attend military conferences, he made increasingly absurd claims. The Luftwaffe was on the verge of a great victory. New aircraft were coming that would dominate the skies. The bombing would stop as soon as these new weapons arrived. His subordinates had learned to nod and agree, then returned to their offices to deal with reality as best they could. The reality was that by late 1943, the Allies had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They were bombing Germany around the clock. The RAF came at night, the Americans by day. There was no respite, no time for repair, no period when German fighters could rest and regroup. The strain on German air defenses was immense. Flak crews worked in exhaustion, firing tens of thousands of shells at each raid, rarely hitting anything but filling the sky with deadly fragments. Fighter pilots flew multiple missions per day, scrambling to intercept one raid only to land, refuel, and take off again to face another. Ground crews worked through the night to repair damaged aircraft, often under air raid conditions themselves. And then, in December 1943, the P-51 Mustang arrived in significant numbers. This was the aircraft German intelligence had underestimated, the fighter that would break the back of the Luftwaffe. The Mustang could fly to Berlin and back, could escort the bombers all the way to their targets and home, again. It was fast, maneuverable, and produced in vast numbers. American pilots, many of them with only 50 or 60 hours of combat training, found themselves flying an aircraft that could outperform anything Germany had, except the rare Me-262 jet. In January 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force began Operation Argument, later called Big Week, a coordinated campaign to destroy the German aircraft industry. The targets were the factories themselves, the assembly plants where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were built. The Americans flew in formations of 600, 700, 800 bombers, escorted by equal numbers of fighters. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, throwing everything available into the air, and was slaughtered. German fighter losses during Big Week were catastrophic. Over 600 aircraft destroyed, along with hundreds of pilots killed or wounded. These were not the losses that could be replaced. These were experienced pilots, men with hundreds of hours of combat time, squadron leaders and flight instructors. The Luftwaffe would never recover. From February 1944 onward, the Allies had air superiority over Germany. Not just over the battlefield, not just over the occupied territories, but over Germany itself. Speer, watching the production reports, knew exactly what this meant. In a meeting with Hitler in March 1944, he laid out the numbers with brutal clarity. Aircraft production was down 30%. Ball-bearing production had collapsed. Synthetic oil production was under constant attack. If the bombing continued at this rate, German armaments production would fall below the level needed to sustain military operations within 6 months. The war would be lost not because of defeats on the ground, but because the Wehrmacht would simply run out of weapons, fuel, and ammunition. Hitler's response was to accuse Speer of defeatism. The Führer insisted that German will would overcome material disadvantages, that new weapons would arrive in time, that the alliance between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would collapse, giving Germany breathing room. He ordered increased fighter production, but the orders were meaningless. The factories that built fighters were being bombed. The fuel to power fighters was being destroyed at the synthetic oil plants. The pilots to fly fighters were being killed faster than new ones could be trained. Göring, by this point, had become almost irrelevant. His promises had proven empty, his leadership absent, his understanding of the situation delusional. In military conferences, other officers simply ignored him, directing their questions to Milch or to the operational commanders who were actually trying to manage the disaster. Göring's response was to blame his subordinates, to claim that the Luftwaffe had failed him, rather than acknowledging that he had failed the Luftwaffe. The German fighter pilots, the men actually flying against the Allied bombers, had their own perspective on High Command's failures. Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top aces and the general of the fighter arm, was increasingly vocal in his criticism. The Luftwaffe needed more fighters, not bombers. It needed better tactics, not Hitler's orders to ram bombers. It needed experienced pilots, not teenagers with 60 hours of training. Galland's relationship with Göring deteriorated throughout 1944, reaching the point where Göring accused him of cowardice and defeatism for simply telling the truth about the situation. By the summer of 1944, American bombers were flying to targets across Germany with near impunity. The Luftwaffe could still mount local resistance, could still shoot down individual bombers, but it could no longer stop the raids, could no longer prevent the systematic destruction of German industry. The Ruhr was being pounded into rubble. Berlin was burning regularly. The synthetic oil plants that Speer had warned about were being destroyed one by one, strangling the Wehrmacht's mobility. In August 1944, Speer gave Hitler a memo that read like an epitaph. Oil production had fallen to 30% of the previous year's level. Aircraft fuel production was down to 20%. Tank production was limited not by factory capacity, but by lack of steel, which was limited by lack of coal, which was limited by bombing of the Ruhr. The Wehrmacht in the West was already experiencing fuel shortages so severe that tanks were being abandoned for lack of diesel. The situation would only worsen. Hitler filed the memo and continued planning offensives. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, the last major German attack in the West, was predicated on capturing Allied fuel supplies because Germany no longer had enough fuel to sustain the operation otherwise. When the offensive failed, partly because the Luftwaffe couldn't provide air cover due to lack of fuel and pilots, Hitler blamed the generals, blamed the weather, blamed everyone except the strategic bombing campaign that had systematically destroyed Germany's capacity to wage war. Goebbels, in his diary, was more honest. By late 1944, he was writing openly about defeat, about the need to negotiate, about the impossibility of winning. The Allied bombing had accomplished what ground campaigns had not. It had broken the back of German war production. The cities were in ruins. The factories were destroyed or operating at a fraction of capacity. The transportation network was so damaged that moving goods from factory to front was nearly impossible. The civilian population was exhausted, demoralized, increasingly open in their criticism of the regime despite the risks. The final irony was that German High Command had known this was possible. Before the war, the Luftwaffe's own studies had concluded that Germany was vulnerable to strategic bombing, that the Concentration of industry in the Ruhr made it an obvious target that Germany lacked the resources for a prolonged air defense campaign. Göring had dismissed these studies. Hitler had ignored them. They had believed that the war would be short, that Germany would win before strategic bombing could take effect, that the Luftwaffe's offensive power would deter Allied bombing. They had been wrong about everything. The war was not short. Germany did not win quickly. The Luftwaffe's offensive power proved irrelevant once Germany was fighting a defensive war. And the Allies, particularly the Americans, had the industrial capacity to build a strategic bombing force that dwarfed anything Germany could defend against. By early 1945, the bombing had evolved beyond strategic targeting. The Allies were hitting anything that moved, any factory still operating, any rail yard still functioning. Dresden was destroyed in February, a firestorm that killed tens of thousands, though the city had little military significance. The justification was that everything in Germany was now a legitimate target, that the entire economy was geared toward war, that destroying cities would hasten the end. Speer, in his final meeting with Hitler in March 1945, told the Führer that the war was lost, that Germany should surrender to minimize further destruction. Hitler's response was to order the destruction of all remaining German infrastructure, the scorched earth policy that would leave nothing for the Allies to capture. Speer, to his limited credit, worked to sabotage these orders, to preserve what he could for post-war Germany. Göring, by this point, had fled to Bavaria, taking his looted art collection with him. He was no longer giving orders, no longer pretending to command the Luftwaffe. In April 1945, he sent Hitler a telegram suggesting that since Hitler was trapped in Berlin, perhaps Göring should assume leadership of the Reich. Hitler's response was to strip Göring of all ranks and titles, to order his arrest for treason. The Reichsmarshal, who had promised no enemy bomber would reach the Ruhr, ended the war under house arrest, his Luftwaffe destroyed, his promises revealed as lies. The final tally was staggering. The Allied strategic bombing campaign dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany. It killed an estimated 300,000 to 600,000 German civilians. It destroyed or severely damaged more than 60% of German cities. It forced Germany to divert enormous resources to air defense, resources that could have been used on the Eastern Front, and most significantly, it destroyed German industrial capacity to the point where the Wehrmacht could no longer be supplied, could no longer replace losses, could no longer sustain operations. German High Command's response to the bombing had been characterized by denial, delusion, and desperation. Göring had promised the impossible and then blamed others when he failed to deliver. Hitler had demanded retaliation and miracle weapons instead of facing strategic reality. Speer had warned repeatedly about the consequences, but was ignored until it was too late. Milch had proposed rational solutions that were rejected for political reasons. Galland and the operational commanders had fought as best they could with inadequate resources and impossible orders. The lesson, if there was one, was about the gap between propaganda and reality, between what leaders claimed and what they could actually deliver. Göring had built his reputation on the Luftwaffe's early victories, on the conquest of Poland and France, on the image of German air superiority. When that image collided with the reality of Allied industrial power and strategic bombing, he chose to maintain the image rather than face the reality. Hitler had built the Third Reich on the myth of German invincibility, of will triumphing over material disadvantages. When the bombers came, when the cities burned, when the factories were destroyed, he insisted that will was still enough, that new weapons would arrive, that the situation could still be reversed. But will could not stop bombs. Propaganda could not repair destroyed factories. Delusion could not replace lost pilots or fuel or steel. The Allied bombers reached the Ruhr by day and Berlin by night because they had the industrial capacity, the technical capability, and the strategic focus to do so. German High Command's response was to deny, to rage, to promise, and ultimately to fail. They had built a military machine that could conquer countries but could not defend against an enemy that attacked from the air with overwhelming force. They had started a total war without understanding what total war meant when the enemy had greater resources and was willing to use them without restraint. In the end, what German High Command said when Allied bombers reached the Ruhr by day and Berlin by night was less important than what they failed to do. They failed to adapt their strategy. They failed to concentrate resources on air defense. They failed to tell their population the truth. They failed to negotiate when negotiation might still have saved something. And they failed to understand that the war they had started would be won or lost, not on battlefields but in factories, not by soldiers but by industrial workers, not through conquest but through production and destruction. The bombers came, and German High Command had no answer except promises they could not keep and rage they could not direct effectively. The cities burned, the factories fell silent, and the Third Reich collapsed under the weight of its leaders' delusions.